Something is shifting, and if you're not paying attention, you'll miss exactly who's filling the vacuum. China just sent an envoy to Gulf talks following Iran's recent attacks. Let that sit for a moment. Not the United States, not NATO, China. The same China that not long ago was considered a peripheral player in Middle Eastern diplomacy is now sitting at the table where wars get cooled down or heated up. This isn't accidental. This isn't charity. This is strategic architecture being built in real time, brick by brick, while much of the American public is still operating on a mental map drawn decades ago, a map where Washington sets the agenda and everyone else follows. That map is outdated. What we are watching right now is a fundamental reorganization of global power. And the Gulf region, sitting on the world's most consequential energy reserves, is precisely where that reorganization is being negotiated, tested, and slowly, deliberately made permanent. Now, to understand why this moment matters so deeply, we have to go back not centuries, but just a few decades, because the story of American dominance in the Middle East is actually a relatively recent story. After World War II, the United States emerged as the undisputed architect of the global order. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. American military bases spread across continents, and the Middle East, with its oceans of oil, became one of the most critical theaters of American foreign policy. The logic was simple and brutally honest. Whoever controls energy controls the global economy, and whoever controls the global economy controls the world. Washington understood this, and for decades it worked. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia chief among them, operated within an unspoken agreement with the United States. You sell your oil in dollars, you buy American weapons, you host American military infrastructure, and in return we guarantee your security. That was the deal. That was the architecture of the post-war Middle Eastern order, and for a long time almost nobody seriously challenged it. But here is what the textbooks rarely tell you about power. It does not collapse all at once. It erodes, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look up and the furniture has been rearranged and someone else is sitting in your chair. That is precisely what has been happening in the Middle East over the last 15 years. And what China's envoy arriving at Gulf talks represents is not a beginning. It is a visible symptom of a process that has been quietly underway for a very long time. China did not wake up one morning and decide to insert itself into Gulf diplomacy. It built toward this moment with the kind of patient, long-term strategic thinking that the United States, caught up in its own electoral cycles and short-term political calculations, has consistently struggled to match. Let's talk about what China actually did, because the mechanism here is important. In March of 2023, China brokered a historic diplomatic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that had been bitter regional rivals for decades, two countries whose antagonism had structured much of the sectarian and geopolitical conflict across the broader Middle East. Saudi Arabia is the heart of Sunni political Islam. Iran is the center of Shia political power. Their rivalry is theological, historical, and deeply material. It is about oil, about influence, about which vision of Islam and which patron power shapes the future of the region. For years, the conventional wisdom in Washington was that this rivalry was essentially permanent, that it served American strategic interests to maintain a balance of tension, and that no outside power had either the credibility or the leverage to meaningfully alter that dynamic. China proved all of that wrong in a single diplomatic stroke. And the world noticed. Now Iran has conducted attacks that have once again rattled the Gulf, once again raised the temperature in a region that is always dangerously close to boiling. And where is China? China is sending an envoy. China is at the table. China is positioning itself not as a distant observer, but as an active participant in the process of managing the aftermath. Think about what that means structurally. When a crisis erupts and one power shows up with diplomats while another power shows up with aircraft carriers, The world draws conclusions. Those conclusions accumulate over time. They shape relationships, they shape trust, they shape the architecture of future arrangements. The Gulf states are drawing their own conclusions right now, and those conclusions are not moving in America's direction. To understand why the Gulf states are increasingly open to China's presence, you have to understand what those states actually want in this historical moment. They want something very specific. They want economic diversification because they know that the age of oil as the singular foundation of their wealth and power is finite. They want technological partnership because the future of their economies depends on building industrial and technological capacity that does not currently exist at the scale they need. They want security, but they want a particular kind of security, not the kind that comes with ideological conditionality, not the kind that requires them to bend their domestic political arrangements to satisfy a foreign power's demands about democracy or human rights. China offers all of this without the lecture. That is not a small thing. That is actually a very large thing when you are a Gulf monarchy that has spent decades navigating the uncomfortable tension between needing American security guarantees and resenting American political pressure. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, the ambitious economic transformation program that Mohammed bin Salman has staked his entire legacy on, is deeply intertwined with Chinese investment, Chinese technology, and Chinese economic partnership. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, despite all of its complications and criticisms, has woven China into the infrastructure of dozens of countries across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. China is building ports, roads, pipelines, digital networks. It is creating physical and economic dependencies that translate directly into political relationships. When you owe your infrastructure to someone, when your trade flows through their networks, when your students are being educated in their universities and your industries are being built with their capital, you develop a different kind of relationship with that power than you have with a country that primarily shows up to sell you weapons and ask you to comply with its foreign policy objectives. And this brings us to a deeper truth about what is happening in the global order right now, something that goes beyond any single diplomatic event or any single regional crisis. We are living through the end of unipolarity, the period from roughly 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, to some point in the early 2020s, was the era of a single dominant power, the United States, setting the rules, enforcing the norms, and structuring the choices available to every other actor in the international system. That era is not ending because the United States did something catastrophically wrong, although there have certainly been catastrophic mistakes. It is ending because of the fundamental dynamics of capitalist competition on a global scale. When you have a system built on competition and the drive to accumulate, it inevitably produces rivals. The investment of American capital in China's development, the offshoring of American manufacturing, the integration of China into the World Trade Organization, all of this was done in the name of profit, in the name of market expansion, in the name of the logic of capital. And it worked magnificently for American corporations and for Chinese development simultaneously. But it also built the very rival that is now rearranging the diplomatic furniture in the Gulf. This is the profound irony that so much of American political commentary refuses to sit with honestly. The rise of China is not an accident. It is not the result of espionage or theft alone, though those things happened. It is the result of the normal operation of a global capitalist system in which American businesses made rational profit-seeking decisions that collectively transferred enormous productive capacity to China over several decades. And now that China has that productive capacity, now that it is the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest trading partner for most countries on Earth, the world's largest holder of foreign exchange reserves, Now it has the material foundation to project diplomatic and strategic power in ways that were simply not possible 30 years ago. Power follows productive capacity. It always has. That is not ideology, that is just history. Now, what does Iran's role in all of this look like? Because Iran is not simply a disruptive actor here, though it certainly plays that role. Iran is also a pivot point. Iran sits at the intersection of multiple overlapping conflicts and competitions between Sunni and Shia Islam, between Arab nationalism and Persian nationalism, between American containment strategy and Russian and Chinese counterpositioning. When Iran conducts attacks that destabilize the Gulf, it is doing so within a context where it knows that certain great powers have an interest in managing rather than resolving that instability. Russia benefits from high oil prices that tend to accompany Gulf tensions. China has a more complex relationship with instability. It needs stability for trade, but it also benefits from being the power that provides that stability rather than the United States. So China's response to Iranian aggression is not to condemn Iran and align with Washington. It is to engage diplomatically, to position itself as the indispensable mediator, to turn a moment of crisis into a demonstration of Chinese relevance and Chinese capability. And here is what makes this so consequential for ordinary Americans. This is not just about distant geopolitics. This is about the dollar. This is about the foundation of American economic power in a very direct and practical way. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which Gulf oil is priced and traded in US dollars, has been one of the pillars of American economic dominance since the 1970s. It means that every country in the world that wants to buy oil has to acquire dollars first. That creates a permanent structural demand for dollars. It allows the United States to run trade deficits that would bankrupt any other country. It allows the Federal Reserve to print money in ways that would trigger hyperinflation in any economy that did not have the dollar's unique global status. The petrodollar is not just a financial arrangement, it is a geopolitical weapon, a source of extraordinary privilege, and a mechanism of structural power that underpins everything from American military spending to the living standards of ordinary American households. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have recently been discussing oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. China and Saudi Arabia have discussed yuan-denominated oil transactions. This is not a completed shift. This is not a catastrophe that has already happened, but the direction of travel matters enormously. If the petrodollar system frays, if it does not collapse overnight but simply becomes less dominant over a period of years and decades, the consequences for American economic power are profound. The ability to finance deficits, to maintain military expenditure, to provide social programs without the discipline that other countries face, all of this rests in part on the dollar's reserve currency status, which itself rests in part on the Gulf states' willingness to price their oil in dollars and park their surplus revenues in American financial assets. When China sends an envoy to Gulf talks, it is not just participating in a regional diplomatic process. It is participating in a negotiation about the future architecture of the global monetary system. That is what is actually at stake. Let us also be honest about what American foreign policy has looked like from the perspective of the Gulf states over the last 2 decades, because context matters. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 destabilized the entire region, empowered Iran enormously because Iraq under Saddam Hussein was the primary Arab counterweight to Iranian power, and demonstrated that American military intervention could produce outcomes that were deeply contrary to the interests of America's own Gulf allies. The Arab Spring created enormous anxiety in Gulf monarchies about whether the United States would protect authoritarian partners or sacrifice them to democratic pressure. The Obama administration's pursuit of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was seen in Riyadh as a fundamental betrayal, as Washington reaching an accommodation with Iran at the expense of Saudi interests. The chaotic American withdrawal from Afghanistan sent a message about the reliability of American security commitments, and the sporadic, inconsistent American pressure on Saudi Arabia over human rights, particularly after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, created genuine uncertainty about whether the old security for compliance deal was still operative. From Riyadh's perspective, the United States has been an increasingly unreliable partner, not because American intentions are necessarily hostile, but because American domestic politics have made consistent long-term strategic commitments increasingly difficult. Every new administration revisits the previous administration's approach. Every election cycle introduces the possibility of dramatic policy reversals. China, whatever its faults, and they are many and significant, offers something that authoritarian Gulf monarchies find genuinely attractive: consistency. The Chinese Communist Party has been in power for over 70 years. Its strategic objectives do not change with elections. Its commitments, once made, tend to be durable because there is no opposition party to reverse them, no electoral pressure to pander to a domestic base that might have different preferences. For Gulf states making 30-year bets on economic transformation, that consistency has real value. None of this means that the Gulf states are choosing China over the United States in some clean binary sense. The reality is far more complex and interesting than that. What they are doing is something that smaller and middle powers throughout history have done when a unipolar moment begins to fade. They are hedging. They are distributing their relationships across multiple great powers so that they are not entirely dependent on any single patron. They are using the competition between great powers to extract better terms from all of them. They are, in short, behaving rationally within a changing power environment. The old binary choice, you are either with Washington or against it, is no longer operative because the material reality of Chinese power has created a genuine alternative. When you have an alternative, you use it as leverage. That is not betrayal, that is statecraft. What is striking, and what Americans watching this unfold need to genuinely grapple with, is how little of this trajectory has penetrated mainstream American political discourse. The debate in Washington remains almost entirely structured around the old framework. How do we maintain American primacy? How do we counter Chinese influence? How do we reassert American leadership? The premise that American primacy is a structural feature of the international system rather than a historical conjuncture is rarely questioned. The possibility that the United States might need to develop a foreign policy framework appropriate to a multipolar world, one in which American power is still very significant but no longer singular, is treated as defeatism rather than realism. But this is precisely the adjustment that history demands, and the failure to make it is itself a strategic liability. You cannot navigate a world you refuse to accurately perceive. And there is a moral dimension to this that deserves honest attention, because geopolitics is not just about power, it is also about legitimacy. The international order that the United States built after World War II was not purely a projection of American self-interest. It also embodied, however imperfectly and selectively, certain genuinely valuable principles: the prohibition on aggressive war, the architecture of international institutions, the framework of human rights. The United States frequently violated these principles when its interests dictated, but the principles themselves had real value and real effects. As American power recedes, the question of what replaces those principles becomes genuinely urgent. China is not offering a world of liberal internationalism. China is offering a world of transactional sovereignty. Your internal arrangements are your business. We will not ask questions. We will do deals. That is attractive to authoritarian governments, but it represents a real regression in the global moral framework that the post-war order at its best aspired to. This is the genuine tension at the heart of this moment. American power was never as benign as its own propaganda claimed, but the alternative power that is rising is not offering a more just global order. It is offering a more explicitly transactional one. And for those of us who care about things like labor rights, democratic governance, freedom of expression, and the capacity of ordinary people to shape the conditions of their own lives, the question of how those values survive and advance in a multipolar world is one of the most serious questions of our time. It is not answered by simply cheerleading for American primacy or by naively celebrating the decline of American hegemony. It requires a much more rigorous and honest analysis of what a just and stable global order would actually look like, who would enforce it, and what material conditions would be necessary to sustain it. What China's envoy at Gulf talks represents, in the end, is a data point, one of many, in a transition that is already underway, and that no single policy decision or military deployment is going to reverse. The structural conditions that are driving this transition, China's productive capacity, the financial architecture of the petrodollar, the exhaustion of American military overextension, the rational hedging behavior of middle powers, these are deep forces operating over long time horizons. They can be influenced at the margins. They can be managed more or less wisely. They cannot be wished away or shouted down. And the first step toward any kind of wisdom about them is to see them clearly, to name them accurately, to resist the temptation of the comfortable story that America's position in the world is simply a reflection of its values and virtues, rather than of historical contingency and material power. The Gulf will continue to be a theater of great power competition. Iran will continue to be a disruptive force whose actions reflect its own rational calculation of its interests in a dangerous neighborhood. China will continue to insert itself as a diplomatic and economic player because it has every material incentive to do so, and because it has built the capacity to do so effectively. The United States will continue to have significant interests and significant influence in the region. American military infrastructure, American financial ties, American diplomatic relationships do not simply evaporate, but the terms on which American influence operates are changing, and pretending otherwise, whether in Washington think tanks or in the American media, does not change the reality. It just leaves ordinary Americans less prepared to understand the world they are actually living in and less equipped to make the kinds of democratic demands on their own government that a genuinely informed citizenry would and should make. That gap between the story Americans are told and the world as it actually functions, that gap is itself one of the most consequential political facts of our time.